The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, is the Middle East headed for all-out war? Then, historian Timothy Snyder on whether freedom is misunderstood. That's all ahead on the agenda. One year after Hamas's attack on Israel, the war in Gaza shows no signs of stopping. Now, following Israel's incursion into Lebanon and Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israel, is the Middle East on the verge of a full-blown regional war? Here with their analysis, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Vesma Momani, professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And with us here in studio, Arif Lalani, former Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, Jordan, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. He's also a senior advisor at Strategy Corp. And John Allen is here, former Canadian ambassador to Israel and senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And gentlemen, it's good to have you two here for the first time. And Besma, great to see you again, although, how do I say this? I wish it were on a happier occasion. Let's put it that way. Let's stipulate off the top here that people who may be watching this at 8 or 11 o'clock on television tonight, we are not live. We are taping this during the course of our day, and therefore it's possible events may pass us by, so we put that on the record in case our discussion looks hopelessly out of date by 8 o'clock tonight, but I don't think it will be. Besma, to you first. Even before the incursion into Lebanon by Israel, there were concerns in Israel that Hamas had really stretched the Israeli military pretty thinly. The economy in Israel is facing some sharp challenges. There are protests in Israel to bring the hostages home. In your view, to what extent can Israel take on a second front in this war in its north against Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Well, it's all a matter of at what cost. I mean, can it? Is a bigger question, but it's a matter of at what cost. And I think there's a lot of worrying signs here, especially after Netanyahu last night said something I think that really stood out. It was effectively a warning to the Lebanese people saying, get rid of Hezbollah or you will become like Gaza. And I can't help but feel that today Lebanese are waking up to feeling that this was a threat. And again, it may not have been meant that way, but it certainly was perceived that way. And that is really ominous. So it's all about at what cost. I mean, if he is foreboding what happened in Gaza to happen in Lebanon, and we've already had 1 million people displaced in Lebanon. We know that people in Gaza have been displaced many times. I think at this point, 10 times for some people. We're looking at 41,000 dead in Gaza already. Is that the cost? Are we talking about the reality that we have 66% of all buildings in Gaza destroyed? Is that the cost? I mean, it's all has to be part of this broader conversation about Netanyahu has constantly talked about tactics, but has never had a strategy. This is not going to decapitate or bring the end of these organizations. There will be a new leader brought forward. And yes, they've gotten through a number of leaders of Hezbollah, but is Hezbollah over? It's not over. It's a deep, deep organization. I don't think you can say by removing its leader, just like Hassan Nasrallah's previous predecessor who was removed and he came in force, it's just going to continue because there's a core element of this issue, which is they're there to fight the reality that Israel continues an occupation, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that is the broader issue at hand that unfortunately no political leaders are investing in, and Netanyahu has a personal political interest in this war continuing, which is the really sad reality.
I gather you're referring to the fact that if the war ends, suddenly he's under charges on corruption, and therefore that process goes forward. Arif, how about you? How do you see this potential second front in a full-blown Middle Eastern war?
Yeah, look, I think Besma's right. I think Israel is perfectly capable of having a two-front war. The question is the cost. And the question is, will this destroy Hamas and Hezbollah for good? And I think you don't destroy these types of organizations in the war, you actually destroy them in the peace. And what I mean by that is they will not come back The ideology will fade if in peacetime there's actually a reconstruction and a real change on the ground.
Well, that raises the question about whether there is a partner for peace at the moment.
Well, I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult first because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not laid out his objectives. We know his sort of war-fighting objectives, but we don't know what is expected at the end. And I think that is the problem that Israelis will face, because once the war stops, and I think it will, and I think that there is a timeline for that. I've said previously, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to establish as many facts on the ground as possible before the November 5th election in the United States. Regardless of who wins, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to have established as much as he can in terms of territory. So I think that's a timeline.
We'll come back to that international angle in a second, the American angle on that, as it were. Let me ask the question from the other side of the coin to you, John, and that is, Hezbollah has for about a year been lobbing bombs into northern Israel. It's resulted in 50,000 or more Israelis having to flee from their homes because their government can't ensure their security. What exactly do we expect Israel to do under those circumstances?
Well, it's a good question. I agree with both Besma and Arif that there's a problem of tactics versus strategy. On the other hand, Israel has to defend its people. The question is, how do they go about doing it? Yes, they had to respond to October 7th. The Americans told them to do it one way. Don't repeat what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Targeted, don't alienate the people. In Lebanon, getting rid of, frankly, Nasrallah, who's responsible for assassinating a Lebanese prime minister, for the port explosions, for aiding the Syrian leader in massacring his people. That was not a bad thing. And frankly, you've got a body, a non-state actor with one of the largest militaries in the world, operating in Lebanon as a political party and as a military, while it's actually responding to the needs of Iran. Its whole purpose there was to be a deterrent against any attack that Israel might do on Iran.
How's that going?
We'll see. But I would say one other thing, that your original question of can Israel handle this? It's not just a two-front war. It's now a potential activity with Iran. The West Bank is potentially exploding.
So a four-front war.
A four-front war. They're also dealing with Hezbollah in Iraq and in Syria, who are attacking. And they've got the Houthis.
So, a seven-front war.
A seven-front war, and as many people say, it's the war within. And as Besma alluded to, it's dealing with the Palestinian question that is the real threat to Israel.
Arif, let me, there are times when Israel wants international support when it does things. Does this look to you like one of those times?
Well, clearly not. I think the international community and all of Israel's allies, including the United States, at every turn have told the Prime Minister to go one way, and he's gone the other way. So I think the Prime Minister in Israel has decided he is going to take this as an opportunity, as he's put it, to change the balance of power in the region. And I see very few red lines from the international community that actually matter. I think there's one final red line, which is what happens with Iran. I think that is really the only country that has the capability to really inflict real damage on Israel.
As you look, Besma, at I was going to ask Hezbollah versus Hamas, but the way John's put it, it's actually maybe it's a list of 7 potential adversaries right now. What's the heaviest lift out there, as far as you can tell, for Israel?
Well, different lifts for different tactics, if you will. So certainly, I think if what we're seeing, and in all all indications show that we're looking at a ground war. The incursion into Lebanon has already started. So in terms of boots on the ground, that battle with Hezbollah fighters is going to be fierce. Remember here, this is a battle-hardened group that inflicted enormous terror in Syria. They have a lot of experience in guerrilla tactics. So we're going to see a really heavy cost for the Israeli troops in Lebanon, because a ground incursion is where I think not just going back to the point that I really want to highlight here is the extremist and Netanyahu's cabinet wants to take this. They do want, and by many accounts of some of the indication that I've seen, they want to occupy southern Lebanon. They want to actually, they're talking about resettling settlers to southern Lebanon, south of Litani River. Just yesterday, there was a social media post of an Israeli soldier that hiked up an Israeli flag in southern Lebanon, which of course got condemnation from, his senior leaders in the military, but the optics are there. There is a sense and feeling that in Lebanon that we are the next Gaza. And that, if you will, because of all of the horror that the war on Gaza has inflicted on the civilians there, is going to ensure that Hezbollah is so determined to fight. That ground war is going to be brutal. And you can't win it from the air. Remember here, that's what the Israelis have effectively tried to do in the case of Gaza. 2,000-pound bombs to just obliterate the entire peninsula. But again, it's not going to win until it goes into that kind of, ground war in the case of Lebanon, and that is going to be fierce. In the case of Iran, certainly it has a large army. They're not going to send their soldiers. They are using their proxies in all of the places that John effectively noted. All of these so-called axis of resistance are absolutely invoking their forces, but they're not going to devote a single Iranian soldier to this. This is the sad part, is everybody's fighting this proxy war at the expense of other people's civilians, in this case in Lebanon. In the case of Iran, they also don't have a very strong air force. This is one thing that international sanctions have effectively done, is really to prevent them from having a really meaningful air force. But they do have great capability in terms of a great deal of ballistic missiles and other long-range and short-range missiles that I think will be very, very damaging to Israel. The Iron Dome and many other sort of defense systems are well equipped, but it just takes one errand bomb, as we've seen, or missile, I should say, as we've seen just recently in the past attack, to inflict damage. So there is going to be a lot of civilians throughout the region that are going to pay the price for, frankly, incompetence of so many leaders.
Let me circle back to John on something he said a moment ago, and that is you said that after October 7th happened last year, you knew there would be an Israeli response, and there needed to be an Israeli response. Iran, what are we, 180, 190 ballistic missiles were dropped on Israel from Iran not that long ago. There has yet to be an official Israeli response to that. Should there be?
Well, should there be? There will be one. Israel feels a necessity to. This is not the first 180 missiles. This is the second set of missiles sent to Israel from Iran, the first set in April. So unquestionably, Israel feels in this tit for tat that it has to respond.
What will that look like?
Well, the United States, Joe Biden's going to be speaking to Bibi Netanyahu today. He's going to be telling him, please don't go after the nuclear. And frankly, Bibi, you can't go after the nuclear without us. So that's not going to happen. He's going to say, don't do oil infrastructure, because I don't want to see the price of oil screaming up just before an election on November 5th. So
what
he's
does
going
that
to
leave?
It's going to leave ballistic missile launchers, weapons depots, assassinating some Iranian leaders. It's hard to know, but it's quite clear that Israel's got pretty good intelligence in Iran. They were able to assassinate Ismail Haniyeh in a guest house in Iran. So I'm sure they've got some possibilities. Let's just hope that this remains a tit for tat and doesn't accelerate into a broader regional war.
I mean, Arif, if you are the Israeli decision makers and you are looking for a pretext to go after the Iranian nuclear capability, which they have claimed they've wanted to do for as long as a decade now, I guess, 180 ballistic missiles being dumped on your population is not a bad pretext. So what do you anticipate?
Well, I anticipate there's going to be another response. I mean, keep in mind, Iran would say, look, this second round of ballistic missiles was in response to your assassination of a number of our people. So the problem is, when does tit for tat stop? I do think, though, that Prime Minister Netanyahu isn't particularly concerned about the electoral success of the Democratic Party in the United States. So the leverage of please don't bomb oil sites because it'll hurt me, I'm not sure that's going to carry much weight with the current Israeli government. So
you think Netanyahu wants Trump to win the election?
Well, I think he wants, as I've said, to gain as much as he can before that election outcome is out. And so I think that means doing as much damage to Iran's capabilities as he can. So I think everything is probably on the table for Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I'm hoping that people are also counseling Iran not to retaliate. I think Iran has never had it in its strategic interest to have a wider war or to really have a war with Israel directly.
I do want to, let me follow up with Besma on that, because there's an interesting school of thought out there that says part of Israel's response to Iran for the ballistic missile attack, or for other things as well, the American election cycle will factor into that decision. And who Israel wants to become the next president of the United States may have an impact on what they decide to do. How do you see that playing itself out?
Yeah, and I think it's a bit convoluted. Certainly, I think there's a lot of indication that Netanyahu and Trump, from previous, from the first time Trump served, had a very good relationship. And clearly, I'll just point out that Netanyahu, in all of his advertisement throughout Israel for the last election, used tons of posters of him and Trump. And the message was, I have a really close relationship with President Trump. So I think he is really hoping that Trump wins. But Trump also very interestingly said, this war will end on day one that I take control, which, again, one can say is just his bombastic way of speaking. But there was something very interesting about that, because I think either way, if Trump does win, he doesn't effectively take control to January, that will give Netanyahu that runway to sort of do as he pleases. I think that's the message that he's been getting. And of course, Biden, from all of the indications that we see in terms of the American media, and just yesterday, Bob Woodward, who we all know is a respected journalist, wrote a very interesting piece for CNN about how Biden, called Netanyahu a liar with some expletives, said that Israel is on the cusp of becoming a rogue state. It was a very interesting piece that, Woodward noted. There's so many of these, arguments out there and articles in American press about how Biden is really frustrated and is trying so hard to contain Netanyahu, and Netanyahu isn't listening to him. And yet, I think one of the things that we need to zoom out here is that when it's delivering $18 billion in weapons to the Israelis and continuing to supply it, in the case of Iran today, it does not see that it's fighting just a war with the Israelis. This is the part that's really scary in terms of its expansion, is that they do feel that this is now really a war with the Americans. And that is really problematic. That's where we have to worry, that we are seeing the entire region descend into a place of proxy battle between the Americans and the Iranians, and nobody wins. And certainly when we talk about proxy, it means that the Iranians and the Americans are not paying the price. This is really important. It's all the other civilians across the region, whether they're Lebanese, Israeli, Palestinian, Yemenis, etc. That's the part that I think is the most dangerous. And Biden, I think, wants to, frankly, go out on a high of having supported Netanyahu to his very end. He knows he, is looking for a legacy. This man is committed. He's a hard ideologue when it comes to the state of Israel from day one, probably because of his Cold War experience. But nevertheless, I don't think he's going to be tough on Netanyahu till the very end. And that means Kamala Harris, who I think would be tougher. She's really tried to stay away from this issue completely because she's got a very tough election in key ridings where Arab Americans might be very impactful, particularly in Michigan. But the reality is her silence on this has also spoken volumes, and she's seen as being complicit with what Biden has committed to. So it's a huge conundrum. I'll just say that American politics is absolutely, as Arif noted, absolutely intertwined in all of this being played out the way it is.
Okay, that's the American scene. John, I want you to bring us home to Canada because, I mean, you can say this, at least the Americans are involved in this thing, deeply involved in this thing. The Canadian government will have zero impact on whatever happens over there, and yet this has been the focus of some considerable back and forth on the floor of the House of Commons. You've got the leader of the Conservative Party accusing the foreign minister of basically being in line with Hamas and anti-Semitic. Do you see any consequences for what's happening in the Middle East playing out in our politics here in Canada?
I see terrible consequences for it. There's already very, very serious polarization in our community. There's polarization between Jews and Muslims. There's polarization within the Jewish community between progressives and establishment. There's an inability of even rabbis and ministers and imams to get together over October 7. And now you've got a situation where at least one politician, and I'll single out Pierre Poilievre, who is trying to use this to win votes. Now, it surprises me a little bit because there are a lot of Lebanese people in this country, and by sticking 100% with Israel and accusing the liberals, frankly, of being anti-Semitic because they've called for a ceasefire or because they've restricted certain weapons is, I think, really quite reprehensible. I think this isn't good for the country. I know it could be a vote getter in certain key ridings, for example, in Toronto. But it's a very dangerous game to play. It's a very Trumpian game to play. Let's divide and conquer. And the country is already polarized enough. We don't need more of it.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. There's only 10 ridings in the whole country out of 343 where the Jewish vote is big enough to make a difference in the outcome. You think Poilievre would risk doing what he's doing for 10 ridings when he's 23 points ahead already?
Yeah.
How come?
10 ridings are important, and he wants to secure that vote. The Jewish vote's an important one. And I just don't, I can't understand another reason why he would call a foreign minister anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas.
Maybe he believes it.
Well, you might, but it's quite a stretch to be calling somebody pro-Hamas in this country when it's been declared a terrorist organization. We prohibit them from coming here and don't allow any funding. It's a bit of a stretch.
Arif, your view on this?
Well, I think the polarization exists. I just worry that humanitarian suffering has been politicized by everybody. So I would stick to the facts. Look, it's a fact that 41,000 people have been killed. The majority of them
I don't want to take away from
civilians.
That, but I don't want to take away from that, but it's a fact that the Hamas sources in Gaza say 41,000 people have been killed. We have to be careful about this.
Sure we do, and it's a fact that journalists aren't allowed in, so we have to rely on the sources that are made available by whoever's controlling the territory. And I think this is the problem. We can argue about whether it's 41,000, but I think you and I would agree that it's in the tens of thousands. So the point is that tens of thousands of civilians have been killed. I don't think that should be a political statement. We can talk about the strategies of the Israelis or of the terrorist organizations. That's a different matter. So I do feel that people are trying to politicize this on all sides. I think the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the NDP, let's face it, everyone has their minds set on the Canadian domestic electoral timeline, whenever that may be. I'm not a politician. I focus on, the lives of innocent people, Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese, and others. And I think if we stick to a humanitarian focus on a humanitarian catastrophe and stick to the politics and strategy on other things, we can resolve this.
Well, let me do something exactly the opposite of what you've just recommended. And again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and Besma, I'll go to you first on this. I remember, and it's got to be 25 years ago, we had on this network Ed Lutwack, who is, of course, one of the, long-standing neoconservative geopolitical analysts. And I remember the expression he used, and I think most of the guests on the program were really quite taken aback when he said it. He said, every now and then, you need a good clarifying war because things are unsettled, and you need a clarifying war so that somebody clearly wins, somebody clearly loses, and only then can you make progress. And I think if he were here today, he would say probably what Trump is saying, which is to say, let the Israelis go in there, let them do what they want to do, let them win, help them win, and then try and pick up the pieces after that. That's a view that's out there. What's your view on that?
Well, you know what I always say, at what cost, and ask the families of the people who've been killed. So the 97 hostages, let's focus on them too, that are still in Gaza, ask their families, because that's exactly what's happening. Netanyahu has said, I don't care about you and your families. I am going to obliterate Gaza. That's what he's doing. So really, I think we have dehumanized this conflict far enough. And the dehumanization of Palestinians, by the way, is unbelievable. We've talked about them in terms of numbers. I agree with the point about polarization. Anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinianism in this country is through the roof. We have dehumanized people. And I think, war cannot be seen through the lens of just geostrategy. We have to talk about the people on the ground. The people on the ground are facing the consequences of all of this. This is not just numbers. To say 66% of Gaza is obliterated and then there's no homes, that's families, that's people. And I think we really dehumanized it. And it's really easy from Washington or Ottawa to have that kind of perspective as though this is just some chessboard game in the Middle East, but it's people at the end of the day.
No, but
and,
I think let me go to Arif on this.
Let me just pick up on
Sure.
that for a second.
Yeah.
Let me just say, I want to turn it around. 4 years after the Yom Kippur War, Sadat was in the Knesset talking peace, and 2 years later, there was a peace agreement. There are times when events like this, I'm not following the quote that you talked about, but there are times when events like this can change history. And what I am hoping for is that we will get rid of Netanyahu in another election, and that people in Israel and in Palestine will realize that, like the Jordanians and the Egyptians have done, and like the Saudis are prepared to do, that enough is enough.
Okay, but Arif, I'm gonna come back to, again, I'm playing devil's advocate to get these issues on the table. Lutwak would say that visit by Sadat to Jerusalem could only have happened because the Israeli Defense Forces were within 50 kilometers of Cairo. It took a clarifying war for Sadat to realize he had no chance of defeating Israel militarily. They had to make peace. Might those circumstances be necessary this time? The utter defeat of one side before the possibility of peace is even on the table?
Yeah, look, I think what's important is the justification of a war is measured in the reconstruction and the rehabilitation at peacetime. And so that begs the question, what are the post-war aims of Prime Minister Netanyahu? And right now, that's not clear. So I think it's very important, as John said, and I think perhaps as you're arguing.
I'm not arguing, I'm just presenting it.
As you're presenting, as the devil's advocate.
Thank you.
What happens after? And I think it's about time now that allies suggest to Prime Minister Netanyahu that needs to be clarified. Other people have talked about World War II and, the clarifying outcome of that. The great powers met before the war was over a number of times to decide how the reconstruction and the rehabilitation would take place. So I think it's really important to look at what will happen after. If the outcome is southern Lebanon being occupied, Gaza being occupied, then there's no strategic change because the Israelis have tried that a number of times. Clearly it hasn't worked.
Not going to work.
So I think we need to look at, one, we need to find a moment where this part of the conflict stops, because I'm not sure that you're going to get the kind of decisive victory in Lebanon that perhaps some people think. But I think you need to look at, as John pointed out, what is the essential question that has to be resolved here? And I think that is the question of how do Palestinians and Israelis live in peace and security for both of them.
Okay.
Just to finish, though, before October 7th, Israel had on its doorstep the proposition of peace agreements with the whole region. With Saudi Arabia, it had one with the UAE, it has one with Jordan and with Egypt and Bahrain. And the remaining issue was the Palestinian question. And many people thought that, look, let's get the agreement with Saudi Arabia, and as part of that agreement, we will do something for the Palestinians. Clearly, that what will we do about the Palestinian issue now is really entwined with the greater regional peace that I think everybody wants. And the final point I'd make is, look, throughout this conflict, the Arab countries have actually stood by their peace agreements with Israel. So the United Arab Emirates has been very quiet on this, in Jordan. And the other thing that I think is really important is Israel is now relying on its Arab peace partners to protect physically Israel. So the Iranian missiles that come have also been shot down by Jordan.
Interesting, eh?
Right? Arab intelligence has actually helped the Israelis.
Okay, I got 2 minutes left, and I want to give one to John and one to Besma on this. John, civil society, is there any role it can play to move things forward here?
Well, certainly within Canada, civil society can play a big role with Muslims, Christians, and Jews trying to understand that both sides see themselves as victims here. Both sides have narratives that are valid but unfortunately conflict. And that, both sides in the end want peace and security. And if the people in Canada realize that and worked together as opposed to grabbing onto one side and sticking on that side, then we could help things here. In Israel, it's even more important. In Israel, you've got ultra-Orthodox and Haredim who don't want to serve in the army, while the seculars pay the taxes. In Israel, you've got people trying to effect a judicial coup and hundreds of thousands trying to protect democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it's important. I work with an organization that brings Palestinians and Israelis together on the ground.
What's it called?
It's called Rosanna Canada.
ROZANA.
That's right.
Okay.
And we train Palestinians and Israelis together.
We're going to encourage people to go to your website and see more about that. Besma, I got the last minute for you. If there's one thing I've heard people observe during the course of this whole thing, it is that the prospects for peace would be a lot better if the Netanyahu government were out and Hamas were out as well. There's no way either of those things is going to happen, though, in the short run, is there? I mean, isn't that the problem?
That is the problem. Absolutely. And so we need to change something from the bottom up. It's not just the leadership. You're right. I don't think it's going to end tomorrow. Because again, part of the challenge is the polarization in Israel, the polarization in the Palestinian territories is becoming more and more radicalized. This is a really sad, sad consequence. I think about Vivian Silver and other peaceniks. They're becoming extinct as people. Less and less peaceniks exist throughout Israel. And again, I've heard a number of folks reflect on this, on the ground in Israel and in Gaza and even in the West Bank, that they don't see how they can have a future with each other, which is just horrendous because neither are going away. This is the reality. They have had their extremists on both sides basically use all of the tools of terror and horror to basically try to push the other out. They're not going anywhere. Israelis and Palestinians are destined to live together in that small, tiny, tiny piece of territory. We need to find ways of making that happen. And I know it's harder and harder every day that goes by when you are effectively making more and more people extreme. And again, it's happening in both communities. And that's the sad part, because we need people like Vivian Silver. We need people like John Allen and his counterpart, Barbara Landau, and others. We need more of these individuals. And instead, we're having more of the extremists take the voice box and increasingly taking the leadership. And that's really, really problematic.
That's Besma Momani from CG, joining us from the nation's capital. Arif Lalani, former Canadian ambassador to a lot of places in the Middle East. John Allen, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, now with the Munk School of Global Affairs. Good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Freedom. In his new book, historian Timothy Snyder explores what it is, how it's misunderstood, and why it's our only chance for survival. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University and the author of On Freedom. And we are delighted that it has brought you back to our studio here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Thank you.
Glad to be with you.
Let's do an excerpt from the book to get us started here. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would, please. In this book, you write, I aim to define freedom. The task begins with rescuing the word from overuse and abuse. I worry that in my own country, the United States, we speak of freedom without considering what it is. Americans often have in mind the absence of something, occupation, oppression, or even government. An individual is free, we think, when the government is out of the way. Negative freedom is our common sense. That's where I want to start, because this notion of positive versus negative freedom will be a new idea to many people watching or listening right now. So what's the diff?
Yeah, well, negative freedom is the idea that it's me against the world, that the only problem is the world. There's a barrier out there. And the dramatic images, which of course come from history and from real experience, are the concentration camp, the foreign occupation, the barbed wire, the wall. And of course, it's right that sometimes one has to resist. But at the same time, that's not enough for freedom. So even when the walls come down, there's still the question of who you are. In fact, the only reason why the wall is a bad thing is because it's holding you back. And so freedom from, which is where most people stop thinking about freedom, is really just a part of freedom too. Getting the barriers out of the way is just the first step towards creating the conditions where you and I and everybody else can actually say, what do we really like? What do we really care about? What do we really love? What do we value? How do we want to change the world? That's freedom in the positive sense.
Why do you think it's important to make the distinction?
First of all, I'm doing a very old-fashioned thing here. I'm trying to get it right. I'm trying to get it right. I'm not saying what people say about freedom. I'm not talking about how the word is used. I'm trying to say what it in fact is, and I deeply believe that it is the ability to choose among the good things. There are good things in the world. When we're in a condition or a state to choose among them, then we're free. But the political answer is, if you only believe that freedom is negative, you'll get persuaded that the government is only your opponent. You'll shrink the government, and the government will end up not being able to do precisely the things that it needs to do to help people grow up to be free.
Defining freedom is a different ambition, you say, from defending freedom. How so?
Well, in my experience, the one ends up leading to the other. So I wrote a little pamphlet called On Tyranny, which I think we might have talked about a while ago.
We did indeed, yes.
Where
and it was more than a pamphlet. That was a book.
Okay, it was a pamphlet in the honorable sense of the word.
Okay.
Where I was trying to tell people what good practices would be to defend what we have. But people rightfully asked, well, what is it that we have? And I think the answer is that freedom isn't something in the end that you can only defend. You have to express it, create it, realize it, spread it, right? And so the reason why I think we need a book like this, or the reason why we have to think about freedom positively, is we have to get out of the box of just defending things and think instead of opening up a political future.
You've got it sort of defined here in 5 different ways, 5 aspects of freedom, and I'll just list them here.
Sure.
Sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, solidarity. In your view, do all 5 need to be present for a society to truly be free?
Yeah. So the way the book is set up, this would take one step back if I could. In the beginning, I say what I think freedom is, which is there are good things in the world, they conflict, you have to think about them. Over the course of a life, as you make decisions, you create character. Freedom's positive that way. But it's also positive politically because we have to work together to create the conditions where people could have that kind of life. The things that you mentioned, the sovereignty, the unpredictability, the mobility, the factuality, the solidarity, those are the places where the ideas meet the politics, where real life meets the ideas. And we need as much of all of those things as possible, and also in order. So by sovereignty, I mean the sovereignty of the person, because I think when we talk about freedom, we have to not assume that everybody is already an adult with property and has their life together, we have to think instead about a baby crying. We have to think, what are the things we have to do from the beginning so that that child has a chance to be sovereign, that child has a chance to have the ability to be free.
You had a very funny way of describing that in the book, actually, where you say babies are not born free. They're born hooked up to an umbilical cord and covered in their mother's blood. That's a pretty stark way of looking at it. But you're right.
But it's the only way of looking at it, Steve. It's the only way of looking at it. And our whole conversation about freedom abstracts away from that. We assume, I mean, in the tradition of writing in English about freedom, we're assuming that there is essentially a Victorian age British gentleman with a plantation and perhaps some, servants or slaves in the background. That's already built into the picture. We have to not do that. We have to be serious, which means thinking about the way life actually happens from birth to death and all the adventures in between.
As we in Canada look at your country, we assume you are obsessed with it, and we also assume that you think you have it better than anybody in the world. And it may come as a surprise to some of our viewers and listeners that you actually don't think that. So let's do another excerpt from the book here. By no meaningful index are Americans today among the freest peoples of the world, you write. An American organization, Freedom House, measures freedom by the criteria Americans prefer, civil and political liberties. Year after year, about 50 countries, 50, do better than us on these measures. Our northern neighbor, Canada, stands far above us. The countries where people tend to think of freedom as freedom to are doing better by our own measures, which tend to focus on freedom from. Okay, here we are again. Let's revisit this again, like freedom to and freedom from. Do we understand these concepts well enough?
So, first of all, congratulations on getting one of the Canada references into the show.
Just doing my job, sir. Yeah.
But the serious point is, if you only insist on freedom from, then you're going to get trapped. It's not just that you're not going to think about vacation, parental leave, free kindergarten, childcare in terms of freedom, which you should do. It's also that in shrinking the government, you're going to create space for oligarchs because power abhors a vacuum. So other people will rush in, social media platforms will rush in, they'll control the conversation about freedom. So two things go very wrong if you're only thinking about freedom negatively. If you think about it positively, then you have a chance for children to grow up in a situation where they can learn to think for themselves, control their emotions, have relationships, and have a better chance at freedom. And so the funny thing is that if you talk about freedom too much, and in the wrong way, you end up boxing yourself in. You end up never thinking about it, which is, I'm afraid, the American condition too much of the time. And countries like Norway, or I'll say it, Canada, where folks talk less about freedom, may have laid the conditions better to actually live free lives.
You, of course, watched the Democratic Presidential Convention, where the word freedom was used every 30 seconds, which is unusual for the Democrats. Usually that's the Republicans' game.
Yeah.
What'd you think of all that?
That was super interesting. I was actually, for weird reasons, I was actually physically there. And it's interesting, right? Because there's a political move, which is they see Trump dropping freedom, right? As Trump moves more and more openly to just saying, I'm a leader, I want to die in bed in the White House. That's it. As they drop the word, the Democrats are picking it up, which is tactical and smart. And they started with a negative definition because that is American common sense. So they're saying the Republicans will have the government in your bedroom, the Republicans will have the government on your back, the governments will have the government on your body, and we're going to free you of that. But then the Democrats are also able to talk about freedom as freedom too, which the Republicans can't, because the Republicans are way too much in the pockets of the people who need the government to be small and ineffective. So the Democrats can talk about freedom too, and you see them kind of gingerly pushing in that direction. It's unfamiliar, but they're getting there, and that's encouraging.
You saw the vice president just the other day on 60 Minutes talk about the freedom to bear arms, which she does. She boasted about the fact she's got a Glock and she shot it. That's a different thing for a Democratic nominee to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to not focus so much on the example as on the prepositions, that it's the mental shift to thinking, okay, it's not just about pushing bad things away, but about having good things in the world. And it's consistent, by the way, with the tone of the campaign, right? So when people are angry and talk about freedom, that's a sign things are wrong. When people are happy and talking about freedom, that's generally a sign that they've got it right.
I'm going to do the thing you're expecting me to do now, which is to come back to Canada, and that is, my hunch is there are going to be a lot of people watching this who are going to think, wait a second, Canada more free than the United States? That's impossible. And in fact, we had a convoy of truckers and libertarians and anti-government types, anti-vaccine types who essentially took over Ottawa by driving all their trucks downtown about 3 years ago, and they did so because they were adamant that Canada was not as free as our neighbors to the south. What, in your view, are they missing?
I mean, I saw the convoy, but I didn't actually have a chance to talk to folks, so it's hard for me to say at that level. But I would make the point that freedom is not about impulse. And the way that before the Trump people dropped freedom entirely, the way they swing the whole conversation is that freedom is just about how you feel right this second, and how you feel right this second is valid. It's not about being right or wrong. There's no right or wrong. It's not about true or false. There is no true or false. It's just about how you feel very strongly right now. And that notion of freedom is powerful, it's persuasive, it's addictive. It's just not true. It's just incorrect. You can't be free unless you're recognizing other people's similarity to yourself, unless you're thinking not just about how I feel and how I'm hurt, but you're thinking about what I want the world to be like. I think that's probably the thing that they're missing, because the way the freedom conversation swung in the US, again before Trump dropped it, was away from we have values we can talk about and towards everything I feel right now is valid, and I'm going to listen to my oligarchical leader because he's very good at expressing those hurt feelings.
How would you go about convincing those who believe in the immediacy of freedom that you've just described that there's a little more to it than that?
I think talking and showing, this is the thing, like freedom isn't necessarily about the dramatic, right? Like I cite dissidents from the 70s and 80s and friends of mine who went to prison for what they thought, and that might sound dramatic, but the things they thought were, I should be able to have my own tastes. I should be able to have my own principles. I should be able to live a normal life. I should be able to love the things I love. I should be able to meet other people who have the same kinds of tastes and principles and values and form groups with them. That's what freedom is really about. It's not about being alone and angry. And when you're alone and angry, that's a sign that the thing that you're experiencing is something besides freedom, and you might be on the road towards something worse. Freedom is when you can honestly admit that you care about things that are maybe a little bit unusual or different than what other people care about. And freedom is when you can find other people to do those things with. And the way we make ourselves free together is just by creating the foundation where we as individuals can go off and do these things. Freedom is light. Freedom is relaxed. Freedom is authentic. It's not angry and aggrieved.
Which country does it the best in the world by your indices?
That's a great question, which nobody has yet asked, and I don't know the answer to that. I honestly do not know the answer to that. I would say that there are places in the U.S. where people do it very well.
For example?
Right. So, there are, I would say that, Boston, Massachusetts does it pretty well in many respects. There are cities in the U.S. which do it well, like in the upper Midwest. But in terms of my own personal experience, I would say that, like Austria, which is there's a discussion of childbirth in the book, and Austria is a country which lays foundations for freedom. But the mistake that the Europeans make, which is a different mistake, is they don't describe these institutions in terms of freedom, right? It's always equality, social justice, national solidarity. Whereas I think that what one ought to be able to do is say, like, well, the TTC should be better because then we would be freer people if it were, right? Like, these institutions are there so we can be freer people. The Americans, I think, have it right in talking about freedom. They just do it the wrong way. The places where I feel free, just to be fair, don't necessarily talk about freedom enough, right? So the Nordic countries do it very well, but I don't think they're talking about freedom enough.
Boston and Toronto often get compared, so I'm going to follow up on that. Mm-hmm. Boston famously has, 50, 60 universities there. Are they a big piece of why you believe the city is a free place?
That public transport, the fact that sporting venues are actually inside the city, little things like that. But yes, and education does really matter because it's a very simple point, Steve, but if you take an infant and you leave the infant by the side of the road, just an extreme example, but unfortunately it happens, that child isn't going to grow up free. They're all the things that child needs, and they're not just physical, right? They involve love and attention and time, and past a certain point, that love, attention, and time takes the form of education. So education is part of becoming free. So yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Depending on who wins your presidency on November 5th, how do you see freedom either advancing or not come January 20th?
I think it's a very dramatic difference. Freedom, and it'll be kind of a test of the things we've been talking about. Because if freedom really is just about people doing exactly what they want to do, well, we know Trump is going to do exactly what he wants to do. He's going to put his political opponents in prison. He's going to let the people he likes get rich. He's going to let countries he doesn't like Ukraine, suffer. He's going to let countries he likes, like Russia, do well. He's going to do exactly what he likes. Is that going to bring us a freer world? Obviously not, right? Whereas the Harris people do seem to have the right idea, I think and hope, or want to think, that if you make the institutions better and that you can do this, then you can create a country where people have a better chance for freedom. And and empathy is a big part of freedom. And they, that is Walz and Harris, seem to have empathy for other people, but also for other countries. So, I'm going to say we'll see, but you know what my answer is. My answer is that if Trump wins, it's going to be disastrous for the things we're talking about. And with Harris and Walz, I think we're going to have a chance.
I will follow up on Ukraine because this is a country that you deeply care about, and you have spent a great deal of your personal and professional life helping. And you wrote this, I guess, in Ukraine as well. When you spent all of that time on a train in Ukraine, in part writing this book, what did you learn from Ukrainians about freedom?
I'm glad you asked it that way because it's not so, in this book, a lot of people are helping me. And one of the points of this book is that you can't actually write a book about freedom all by yourself because that's not what freedom is. You need other people to tell you where you're wrong. And if you're a free person, you can do that. I took the book to Ukraine because folks in Ukraine were talking about freedom. And I think they got several important things right. One of them is the positive thing that we talked about before. They use the word deoccupation, which is interesting. So we deoccupied this village. That doesn't mean everyone is free. People were going to be free after we clear the rubble, restore the bus service so that people can have normal lives. Ukrainians are a little bit obsessed with the trains. Like they think a town is free when you can run a train to it and back again. That's when it's actually free. But the other thing has to do with values, going back to the very beginning. A lot of folks, not only in North America, but in Europe and around the world, agreed with the Russians that when Russia invaded, the Ukrainians would flee. And they didn't. And why didn't they? Because they weren't just following impulse. The impulse would be you run from superior force. But maybe if you're a free person and you've lived a life following values, you get to this thing called character, where being a free person actually means you don't follow impulse. You actually have to stay and do the thing that you feel like you have to do. Freedom's about that. And in talking to President Zelensky and other people, that helped me with this definition as well.
I do, since you've mentioned his name, have to point out that on the back of the book, okay, John Meacham gives you a blurb. That doesn't surprise me. He's a well-known historian. And Applebaum, again, no surprise. There's Volodymyr Zelensky's name, the president of Ukraine, on the back of your book, blurbing on why he likes you and this book. How did that happen?
It happened in a way which speaks kind of incredibly well of him. So I have talked to a number of heads of government and state for various reasons, and generally they're affable and charming and generous. But I've never had quite the situation that I had with President Zelensky, which was this conversation when I met him was a couple of years ago already. At the beginning of the war, and I came in, and the Ukrainians were on a counteroffensive, and they had just won back a lot of Kharkiv region. But interestingly, he didn't want to boast about that, which would be, let's accept, a sort of standard politician. He didn't care about talking about that. I had a few political things I thought I needed to explain to him. He already more or less knew what I wanted to tell him. So he looked at me and said, "Well, Professor Snyder, what is it that you want to talk about?" And I said, which is, by the way, not something heads of state usually say. And I said, "I want to talk about the philosophy of freedom." And he said, just like this, he said, "Okay, let's talk about that." And then we talked about the philosophy of freedom for 2 hours. He did not know that's what we're going to talk about. He was not prepared. He was not briefed. But he was willing to talk about his life, about his intellectual influences, about his education, about Shakespeare, about the dissidents, all things which were wonderfully interesting to me. And it seems like, and aside from the things that he instructed me about, like the business about character we just talked about, I also had the feeling, okay, this is a free person. I mean, if someone is actually president of a country that can say to the other person, "What do you want to talk about?" and then actually go for it, that's a sign of a free person.
How shocked are you that the former star of a situation comedy on Ukrainian television is really the clarion caller for freedom in the world today?
I was, maybe a little less surprised than other people, because he always had that thing even before the war that he didn't want the big guy to push him around. That was always clearly present. And then the second element of this is, as you know very well, communications are also a reality. right? And someone who is good at communications can be someone, that's, I mean, for Churchill, I mean, Churchill was also a spectacular comms guy, right? So that is part of being a war leader. But it's you know, one of the things he said to me, I forget whether I quoted in the book or not, is everything is in Shakespeare, that studying theater, thinking about theater is one way to understand human character and tragedy and difficulty, and it's also one way of seeing the overall shape of a situation, and I tend to think that's helped him.
Let's finish up on this. What you pray, obviously, you have worked for a Ukrainian victory, pushing the Russians back, maintaining territorial integrity, giving freedom to the Ukrainian people. What does that actually look like? What does victory look like?
It looks like, well, the hard part is the part that I think North Americans have trouble recognizing, Europeans too. Somebody has to lose. There's not a third way. There isn't this magical thing called negotiations where, you know, some nice person says, hey, why don't you negotiate? And the Russians say, oh, why didn't we think of that? You know, they're there to destroy, they're there to annihilate the Ukrainian state. That's what they're there for. They have to be stopped, and they have to understand they're not going to succeed at any time in doing that. And so the Ukrainians have to win in that sense. Whether that means pushing every Russian soldier off and win, what it means is that Putin understands that he's lost, or that fighting more isn't going to help him. And on the Ukrainian side, it means European Union membership, NATO membership, which is something that I hope Canada would put the shoulder to the wheel on. And it means a European future, and it means at the very least the political aspiration, the legal recognition of the territories that belong to Ukraine.
We do love having you on this program because your writing is fabulous and you give us a great deal to think about. So thank you for making the trip to Toronto, and we appreciate having you here.
I'm glad it worked out. Thank
On
you.
Freedom, Timothy Snyder. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, October 9th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, we'll explore what's behind the rise in youth crime in the province of Ontario. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.